Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Georgia, United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The name Savannah, Georgia, often conjures images of Southern charm, moss-draped oaks, and elegant antebellum homes. But beneath this veneer of gentility lies a history, darker than most care to acknowledge. In the archives of the Chatham County Historical Society, there exists a collection of papers that few researchers have fully examined. These documents, yellowed with age and fragile to the touch, tell a story that challenges our understanding of one of America's most troubling institutions. In 1852, at the height of the American slave trade, an establishment known as the Franklin and Armfield Auction House operated from a three-story brick building on Johnson Square. What separated this particular auction house from others was not immediately apparent to casual observers or even to many of those who conducted business there. It was only through a series of events beginning in 1852 and culminating in discoveries made by a historian in 1963 that the true nature of what transpired within those walls came to light. According to county records, the auction house was owned by James Franklin, a third-generation Georgian and respected businessman who had inherited the establishment from his father. Franklin was known in Savannah society as a pious man who attended First Presbyterian Church every Sunday, contributed generously to local charities, and lived in a stately home on Abercorn Street with his wife, Margaret. His business partner, Thomas Armfield, maintained a lower profile, handling the day-to-day operations, while Franklin cultivated relationships with the plantation owners who formed their clientele. What makes this particular establishment worthy of our attention today is not merely its participation in the already unconscionable practice of human trafficking, but rather the systematic methodology they developed and the elaborate deception they maintained, a deception that would not be fully understood until over a century later. The first indication that something beyond the already terrible norm was occurring at Franklin and Armfield came from an entry in the diary of Elizabeth Palmer, wife of a cotton merchant, who frequently visited Savannah from Charleston. Her diary, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, contains an entry dated April 17, 1852, that reads, "Mr. Palmer returned from Savannah in a most disturbed state. He refuses to speak of what he witnessed at the Franklin establishment, saying only that he shall conduct no further business with the man. I have never seen my husband so affected." 2 weeks later, on May 2nd, she made another, more revealing entry. Mr. Palmer finally spoke of what he observed in Savannah. "I shall not commit the details to paper, as they are too distressing, but it involves Mr. Franklin conducting business of a nature that goes beyond the already deplorable trade in human beings. Mr. Palmer says that Franklin has devised a method to profit from the misfortunes of genteel women fallen on hard times. I pressed for further explanation, but my husband became agitated and would say no more, except that he has written to the authorities in Savannah. I fear, however, that Franklin's standing in that community will protect him from scrutiny." This cryptic entry might have remained nothing more than a curiosity, had it not been for the subsequent investigation of Dr. Marcus Williams, a researcher at Emory University who in 1963 was compiling materials for a comprehensive study of antebellum economic practices. Williams discovered a cache of business ledgers and private correspondence that had been stored in the basement of what had once been Franklin's home, but then converted to a boarding house. The discovery itself was somewhat serendipitous. According to Williams' notes, he had been pursuing a different line of research entirely when the boarding house owner mentioned having found old business papers during renovation work. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lavinia Harding, had preserved the materials out of a vague sense that they might have historical value, though she admitted to Williams that she had never examined them closely. "They belonged to the previous owner," she told Williams, according to his research journal. He left them behind when he sold the house in 1923. I've always meant to donate them to the Historical Society, but somehow never got around to it. Perhaps you'll find them useful, though I can't imagine old business records would be of much interest to anyone. Williams's initial examination of the materials seemed to confirm Mrs. Harding's assessment. The collection consisted primarily of ledgers recording standard business transactions, purchases, sales, commissions, typical of an antebellum auction house. But as he continued to study the documents, Williams noticed discrepancies between the official transaction records and a separate, smaller leather-bound book that appeared to be in a rudimentary code. This second book contained columns of numbers and abbreviated notations that did not correspond to the information in the main ledgers. After several weeks of careful analysis, Williams was able to determine that the numbers represented a parallel set of transactions, recorded in code to obscure their true nature. The breakthrough came when he realized that certain initials in the coded ledger matched the names of prominent plantation owners who appeared in the official records. According to Williams' notes, which are now housed in Emory's special collections, Franklin and Armfield specialized in what they termed complete household transitions. In practical terms, this meant the sale of enslaved individuals who were married or had formed family units. While this was not unusual in itself, what distinguished their approach was that they also targeted white women in financially desperate circumstances, particularly widows or those from families fallen on hard times. These women, according to Williams's analysis, were not officially sold. Such a transaction would have been illegal even in the antebellum South, but were rather placed through a complex system of debt manipulation and legal subterfuge. The coded ledger tracked these unofficial transactions alongside the official ones, using a system where each woman was assigned a numerical value and a set of coded attributes. A letter from Franklin to Armfield dated June 3, 1852, contains the following passage. The Wilkinson woman has agreed to our terms. Her father's debts have left her with no recourse. Ensure that Morgan understands the full arrangement before proceeding. These delicate matters require the utmost discretion. Another letter, dated August 17th of the same year, provides more detail. Miss Wilkinson has been situated at the Morgan plantation. The paperwork reflects her status as a governess, with a substantial advance against future earnings, creating the necessary debt. Morgan is satisfied with the arrangement and has remitted the agreed sum minus our commission. His letter indicates that, after initial resistance, she has begun to accept her circumstances. The arrangement referenced appears to have been a practice whereby these women, facing destitution, would be offered a solution to their financial troubles. They would enter into what they believed to be employment contracts, or, in some cases, marriages with plantation owners seeking wives. What they discovered only after traveling to remote plantations was that their status was far more precarious than promised. The auction house maintained 2 separate viewing areas, connected by a series of hidden passages and observation points. According to architectural plans recovered from the Savannah Historic Preservation Office, these modifications to the original building were made in 1849, 3 years before the events in question. The designs show false walls, peepholes disguised as decorative elements, and a complex system of doors that could be locked from one side only. The architect who designed these modifications, a man named Samuel Whitaker, apparently believed he was creating private viewing areas for wealthy clients who wished to remain anonymous while conducting business. In a letter to Franklin accompanying the plans, Whitaker wrote, "The arrangements as specified will provide the privacy your distinguished clientele requires. The observation points are disguised as decorative elements that will arouse no suspicion, and the passages between viewing rooms will allow movement without detection from the main auction floor." Whether Whitaker was fully aware of the purpose these modifications would serve is unclear. His correspondence maintains a tone of professional detachment, focusing on technical details rather than the human implications of his design. After completing the work on the auction house, Whitaker moved to New Orleans, where he established a successful architectural practice specializing in commercial buildings. He died in 1867, leaving no further commentary on his work for Franklin and Armfield. Dr. Williams's research indicated that potential buyers, wealthy plantation owners from Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, would first be shown the women in what appeared to be a respectable setting, a parlor where tea was served and polite conversation encouraged. These women, believing themselves to be interviewing for positions as governesses, companions, or potential wives, were unaware that they were being evaluated as merchandise. Once these interviews concluded, the prospective buyers would be escorted through a private door to the traditional auction block, where enslaved people were displayed. According to recovered documents, Franklin would then present what he called complete households, groupings that included both the unsuspecting white women and enslaved individuals. The buyers understood that, while the official paperwork would reflect only the purchase of enslaved people, the transaction actually included all individuals presented. A disturbing letter from a plantation owner named Jeremiah Blackwood to Franklin, dated September 1852, reads, "The arrangement has proven satisfactory. The woman believes herself my wife in all respects while fulfilling the duties we discussed. Your discretion in these matters continues to impress." Another letter, this one from a planter named William Coleman in South Carolina, offers more explicit details. "The woman you sent, Miss Harrison, attempted to leave upon discovering the true nature of her position. I found it necessary to explain to her that the papers she signed have placed her deeply in debt to me, a debt that can only be discharged through service. After a period of adjustment, she has become more compliant, though I would not describe her as content. She performs the expected duties adequately, but without enthusiasm. Perhaps your next selection could be of a more naturally submissive disposition." These letters reveal not only the deceptive nature of the operation, but also the casual cruelty with which these men discussed the women they had effectively imprisoned. The language employed, clinical, detached, focused on performance and compliance, demonstrates a complete disregard for the humanity of their victims. The full extent of this practice might never have come to light had it not been for the intervention of federal troops during the Civil War. In December 1864, when General William T. Sherman's forces occupied Savannah, a Union officer named Lieutenant Robert Townsend was assigned to catalog confiscated property, including the abandoned auction house. His official report, preserved in the National Archives, contains a curious notation. "Building contains unusual architecture, seemingly designed for observation without detection. Numerous personal effects of women found in locked rooms on the third floor. Nature of business conducted here appears to extend beyond the documented transactions." Townsend elaborated on these observations in a personal letter to his brother in Boston, which was discovered among family papers donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1935. In this more candid account, he wrote, "The structure itself tells a story that the official records do not. There are hidden passages between rooms, observation points disguised as decorative elements, and most disturbing of all, several rooms on the third floor that appear to have been used to house women for extended periods. These rooms contained personal effects, hairbrushes, garments, books, even half-finished letters, suggesting that the occupants departed in haste or against their will." He continued, "The local people I have questioned are reluctant to speak of the matter directly, but through indirect comments and significant silences, I have pieced together a disturbing picture. It seems that Franklin, the proprietor who fled before our arrival, had devised a system whereby women of good family but reduced circumstances were enticed with promises of respectable employment or advantageous marriages, only to find themselves in conditions little better than bondage on remote plantations." Lieutenant Townsend, disturbed by his findings, conducted interviews with several local residents. One account, from a free black man named Isaiah Jenkins, who had worked as a porter at a nearby hotel, stated, "Those women would arrive in the city full of hope, Dressed in their finest clothes, they'd stay at the Pulaski House for 2 or 3 days, meeting with Mr. Franklin. Then they'd disappear. We thought they'd found positions or husbands in the country. No one asked questions. Jenkins's testimony revealed the carefully orchestrated nature of the operation. The women were accommodated at one of Savannah's most respectable hotels, creating the impression of legitimate business. Franklin would meet them in public places, the hotel restaurant, a park, a church, further establishing an appearance of propriety. It was only after gaining their trust that he would bring them to the auction house, ostensibly to finalize employment contracts or to introduce them to their prospective husbands. The porter's testimony was corroborated by entries in the guest register of the Pulaski House, where numerous women with the same notations, referred by J. Franklin, appeared between 1850 and 1864. Curiously, none of these women ever returned to the hotel. When Townsend attempted to locate any of them, he found no trace of their existence in Savannah society or in surrounding plantations where they supposedly had taken positions. Townsend's investigation was cut short when he received orders to join his unit for the campaign into South Carolina. In his final report, he recommended a more thorough inquiry into the business practices of the Franklin and Armfield establishment. But with the war still ongoing and resources stretched thin, no such investigation was ever conducted. Townsend himself was killed in one of the final skirmishes of the war in April 1865, leaving his incomplete investigation as yet another fragment in the fragmented history of the auction house. The war brought an end to the auction house's operations, and Franklin fled Savannah before Sherman's arrival, reportedly traveling to Texas and then to Brazil, where many Confederate sympathizers sought refuge after the war. Records indicate that he died in Rio de Janeiro in 1871, never having returned to the United States. His partner, Thomas Armfield, was less fortunate. He was captured by Union forces in South Carolina in early 1865. While awaiting trial for unspecified charges, he died of typhoid fever in a military prison. Armfield left behind a journal that remained sealed in military archives until 1942, when it was declassified along with other Civil War documents. The journal, while circumspect in its language, contains several entries that allude to what Armfield called the special arrangements and particular merchandise that commanded premium prices. One entry, dated August 1853, notes, "J.F. has perfected the method. The women now believe completely in their good fortune until arrival at the final destination." The transition period has been reduced to mere weeks rather than months. Another entry from February 1854 provides insight into the psychological tactics employed. J.F. insists that isolation is key to successful adaptation. The subject must be kept apart from both family and other domestic staff until the reality of her circumstances has been fully accepted. Only then may limited interaction be permitted, and even then, under close supervision to prevent the formation of alliances that might encourage resistance or escape attempts. These clinical descriptions of what amounts to psychological torture reveal the calculated nature of the operation. Franklin and Armfield had developed not just a business model, but a methodology for breaking the will of their victims, reducing them to compliance through isolation, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of identity and hope. For nearly a century, the full story remained buried. The building itself was repurposed multiple times as a warehouse, a shipping office, and eventually a restaurant. Few people who dined there in the early 20th century had any knowledge of what had transpired within those walls a century earlier. The architectural modifications that had facilitated the operation were either removed during renovations or disguised as quirky features of an old building. In 1958, during renovations to convert the building into office spaces, workers discovered a sealed room on the 3rd floor. According to the contractor's report filed with the city, the room contained women's personal effects, including hairbrushes, hand mirrors, several daguerreotypes, and approximately 24 letters. These items were turned over to the Chatham County Historical Society, but remained uncatalogued until Dr. Williams began his research. The letters, written by different hands but telling similar stories, provide the most direct evidence of what transpired. One, signed only Catherine, and dated August 1852, was apparently never sent. It reads, "Dearest Mother, I fear I have made a terrible mistake. Mr. Blackwood is not the gentleman he appeared to be in Savannah. I am kept isolated here, miles from the nearest town. The servants regard me with pity rather than respect. Yesterday I overheard Mr. Blackwood speaking to his overseer about his investment. I believe he was referring to me. Something is terribly wrong, but I see no way to return home." Another letter, this one torn in half, contains the fragment. "Understand now that the papers I signed were not what Mr. Franklin represented them to be. I am effectively without rights or recourse. The other women here, there are 3 of us in similar circumstances, warn that any attempt to flee results in the same treatment given to—" The remainder of the letter is missing, leaving historians to speculate about the consequences these women faced. But other documents found in the same sealed room provide disturbing insights. A set of guidelines, apparently written by Franklin himself, outlines the conditioning process for what he terms reluctant companions. The document recommends isolation, sleep deprivation, and the systematic undermining of the woman's sense of identity and worth. One passage reads, "The subject must be convinced that her former life no longer exists. All correspondence must be intercepted. Any mention of family or friends should be met with confusion, as though such persons are figments of an unstable mind. After sufficient time in isolation, introduce the notion that she has always been in her current position, and any memories to the contrary are delusions." Another section advises, "Physical chastisement is to be avoided when possible, as it may leave marks that raise questions among visitors. Psychological methods are far more effective and leave no visible evidence. Deprivation of sleep, inconsistent treatment alternating between kindness and cruelty, and the gradual introduction of tasks of increasing degradation will achieve the desired result without risking damage to the merchandise." This methodical approach to psychological manipulation appears to have been refined over time. Earlier documents show a cruder approach, with more emphasis on physical containment. Later papers reveal a sophisticated understanding of how to break a person's will without leaving visible marks, a process that Franklin, in one letter to Armfield, calls invisible shackling. A particularly disturbing document is a ledger tracking what Franklin termed adjustment periods for various women. Entries include notations such as subject AM, resistance phase 32 days, acceptance phase 47 days, full compliance achieved day 79. Another entry reads, subject ER, continues to resist after 60 days, recommend transfer to Coleman Plantation where stricter methods may be applied. These clinical assessments of human suffering reveal the calculated cruelty of the operation. Dr. Williams's research culminated in a monograph titled The Franklin Method, Exploitation Beyond Bondage in Antebellum, Georgia, submitted to the Journal of Southern History in 1963. Curiously, the article was rejected without explanation. Williams subsequently attempted to publish his findings through other academic channels, but faced resistance at every turn. His academic career suffered, and he eventually abandoned his research, taking a teaching position at a small college in Minnesota. In his personal papers, Williams recorded his frustration with this suppression. "I have encountered resistance at every turn. Archives that were previously open to me are now suddenly closed for cataloging or conservation. Publishers express initial interest only to withdraw it after consulting with their boards. Colleagues who once encouraged my research now suggest I focus on less controversial topics. It is as though an invisible hand still protects the reputations of those involved in this terrible business, even a century after their deaths." In 1965, a fire in the Emory University archives reportedly destroyed many of Williams' original documents. Though some suspect this may not have been accidental, several prominent Savannah families with ancestors connected to the Franklin and Armfield auction house had expressed concern about Williams's research and its potential impact on their reputations. According to a colleague of Williams, who requested anonymity when interviewed for a 2010 article in the Journal of American History, at least one threatening letter was received warning that the reputation of distinguished families should not be sacrificed to historical curiosity. Williams himself became increasingly paranoid in his final years, convinced that he was under surveillance. His personal papers, donated to the Minnesota Historical Society after his death in 1979, include notes about cars following him and strange clicking sounds on his telephone line. While these concerns might be dismissed as the delusions of an aging man, they take on a different significance when considered alongside the systematic suppression of his research. For decades, the story remained largely untold. Then, in 1987, renovation work at the former plantation of Jeremiah Blackwood, by then a historic site open to tourists, uncovered a hidden room beneath the main staircase. Inside were journals spanning the years 1852 to 1864. These journals, now preserved at the Georgia Historical Society, provide the most comprehensive account of what happened to the women, acquired through Franklin and Armfield. The discovery was made by a carpenter named Robert Jenkins, who was repairing water damage to the staircase. In an interview with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Jenkins described removing a damaged panel and finding a small door behind it. It was like something out of a mystery novel. The door was small, maybe 2 feet high, and when I opened it, I found this space under the stairs that wasn't on any of the house plans. Inside was a metal box full of old books. I knew right away they were important. They looked old, and the handwriting was real careful and neat. The site manager, recognizing the potential historical significance of the discovery, contacted the Georgia Historical Society rather than simply incorporating the journals into the plantation's existing collection. This decision proved crucial, as it ensured that the materials would be properly preserved and studied by professional historians, rather than potentially suppressed or selectively presented. Blackwood's journals reveal that he purchased 4 women through the auction house between 1852 and 1855. He documents their attempts to assert their status as free women, the realization of their true circumstances, and the psychological methods he employed to break their resistance. He writes with disturbing detachment about what he called the transition period, during which these women came to understand that their status on his plantation differed little from that of the enslaved people they had been sold alongside. An entry from October 1852 reads, "Mrs. Catherine continues to insist upon her rights as my wife. I have explained that our arrangement grants her certain privileges not afforded to the others, but that she is nonetheless under my authority in all matters. The locked door has proven effective in adjusting her expectations." By 1853, his tone changes. Catherine no longer protests. She has accepted her role and performs her duties without complaint. The method Franklin recommended has proven effective, as it did with the previous woman. Blackwood's journals also reveal the economic calculus behind these transactions. He notes that while the initial investment was higher than purchasing an enslaved woman, the special merchandise provided additional benefits that he considered worth the premium. He writes of Catherine's education and social graces, her ability to maintain accounts and correspondence, and her knowledge of literature and music, all skills that he exploited for his own benefit and status. A particularly revealing entry from April 1853 states, "Catherine's musical accomplishments proved valuable during last evening's dinner with the Hendersons. Her performance on the pianoforte impressed our guests, enhancing the reputation of our household." Henderson remarked that he might consult Franklin about acquiring similar refinement for his own establishment. "I provided Franklin's details while Catherine played, her face betraying nothing of her true circumstances. The training has taken hold remarkably well." This casual description of using Catherine as both entertainment and bait to lure others into the same exploitative system demonstrates the complete moral bankruptcy of those involved. Blackwood saw no contradiction in presenting Catherine as an accomplished member of his household guests while treating her as property behind closed doors. Most disturbing are his casual references to what happened when these women were no longer useful or pleasing to him. An entry from July 1854 notes, "Catherine has become melancholic and unresponsive. Her usefulness is at an end. I have arranged through Franklin for her transfer to a plantation in Alabama, where the owner has a particular interest in such cases. The compensation will offset approximately half of my original investment." This reference to transfer appears multiple times in the journals, suggesting that these women were not just sold once, but potentially multiple times, moved from plantation to plantation, as their mental and physical health deteriorated under the strain of their circumstances. The commodification of these women was complete. They were assets to be exploited until their value diminished, then traded for whatever return could be salvaged. A subsequent entry dated August 1854 provides a chilling postscript. Received word that Catherine did not survive the journey to Alabama. The transport agent reports that she refused food and water after the second day, despite all attempts to force nourishment. Franklin has agreed to a partial refund of the transfer fee, though he maintains that her condition was not his responsibility. I have already engaged him to locate a suitable replacement. The casual notation of Catherine's death, no doubt a result of despair rather than physical illness, and the immediate focus on financial implications and replacement, reveals the complete dehumanization inherent in the system. Catherine, once a free woman with hopes and plans for her future, had been reduced to a failed investment, her death nothing more than a business matter to be resolved between gentlemen. The method, referenced throughout the journals, appears to have been a systematic approach to psychological manipulation, isolation, gaslighting, and the gradual removal of any sense of personhood. What makes these accounts particularly chilling is Blackwood's clinical detachment, as though he were documenting an agricultural experiment rather than the breaking of human beings. Historians now estimate that between 1849 and 1864, Franklin and Armfield may have sold as many as 70 to 80 white women through this clandestine system, in addition to the thousands of enslaved people sold through conventional means. The women came primarily from Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, areas where the auction house had connections with attorneys who alerted them to women in financial distress. The paper trail is fragmentary, as most official records were deliberately falsified. Marriage certificates were forged, employment contracts destroyed, and in some cases, women's very existences were erased from public records. Descendants of these women, if any exist, would likely have no knowledge of their ancestors' experiences. One of the few direct accounts from a survivor comes from a collection of interviews conducted by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867. A woman identified only as Mrs. L. described being sold alongside others at an establishment in Savannah in 1856. She had been widowed and left with substantial debts, and Franklin had approached her with an offer of employment as a housekeeper for a respectable widower. Upon arrival at the plantation, she discovered that her status was far from what had been promised. "I was kept under lock and key for the first month," she recounted. "The master, for that is what he was, though I had been told he would be my employer, informed me that I had been purchased, not hired, and that my debts had been settled in exchange for permanent service. When I protested that such an arrangement was illegal, he laughed and asked who would hear my complaints, isolated as we were." Mrs. L. described how she eventually managed to escape during the chaos of the war, when Union troops approached the plantation and the owner fled. She made her way to a Freedmen's Bureau office, where her story was initially met with skepticism due to her race and the unprecedented nature of her claims. It was only when officials discovered documents in the abandoned plantation house that corroborated her account that she was taken seriously. Her testimony continues. "The most insidious aspect was how they made me doubt my own mind. When I spoke of my life before, my family, my rights as a free woman, I was told that I was confused, that I had always been a servant in the household. When I persisted, I was confined to a darkened room, told that I was suffering from delusions brought on by feminine hysteria. After weeks of such treatment, I began to question myself, to wonder if perhaps my memories were indeed fabrications. It was only the sympathy of one of the house servants who slipped me notes confirming that I had indeed arrived as I remembered, that preserved my sense of self. This rare first-hand account provides insight into the psychological methods employed to subjugate these women. By attacking the very foundation of identity, memory, and personal history, the perpetrators sought to remake their victims into compliant servants, stripped of the will to resist. That Mrs. L maintained her sense of self long enough to seize an opportunity for escape speaks to remarkable psychological resilience in the face of systematic abuse. Even then, her experience was treated as an anomaly rather than evidence of a systematic practice. The bureau officer who recorded her testimony noted in the margins, "Account verified by documents found at the Madison plantation. Appears to be an isolated case of unusual exploitation rather than a common practice." This mischaracterization would persist for nearly a century. In 1992, Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a historian at Howard University, attempted to revive interest in the Franklin and Armfield case as part of a broader study of exploitation in the antebellum South. Her research expanded on Williams' work, incorporating oral histories from descendants of enslaved people who had witnessed the treatment of these women on plantations. One account, from a woman whose great-grandmother had been enslaved on the Blackwood plantation, described how the white lady, who wasn't really the mistress, was kept separate from both the family and the enslaved community. "My great-grandmother said this woman lived in a room off the kitchen. She wasn't allowed to eat with the master's family, but she also wasn't allowed to associate with our people. She existed in between, belonging nowhere. After about a year, she stopped speaking altogether." This observation of a woman existing in between highlights another aspect of the cruelty of the system. By placing these women in an ambiguous status, neither family member nor officially enslaved, their captors created a social isolation that compounded their physical confinement. With no clear place in the plantation hierarchy, they were denied even the limited community and solidarity that enslaved people might find among themselves. Montgomery's research faced many of the same obstacles that Williams had encountered decades earlier. Several archives denied her access to relevant documents, citing preservation concerns. A planned museum exhibit about the auction house was canceled after pressure from donors. Her book manuscript was rejected by multiple publishers, with one editor candidly telling her that certain influential families would make life very difficult for any press that published such material. In an interview for the Journal of Southern History in 2005, Montgomery reflected on this resistance. "What I encountered wasn't just the usual academic skepticism or demand for rigorous evidence. It was a wall of silence, a collective determination that this story should not be told. I received anonymous phone calls suggesting that I focus my research elsewhere. Documents that had been available to me suddenly couldn't be located. Even colleagues who privately expressed support were reluctant to do so publicly. The power of these old families, their influence on institutions and publishing houses, was remarkable even a century and a half after the events in question." Nevertheless, Montgomery persisted. In 1995, she self-published a limited edition of her findings under the title Invisible Chains: The Other Victims of the Southern System. The book received little attention at the time, but has since become an underground classic among historians of the period, circulated in photocopied form before the advent of digital publishing made it more widely available. Montgomery's work brought to light additional accounts from unexpected sources. She discovered a series of letters written by a Presbyterian minister named Reverend Samuel Thornwell, who served a rural parish near the Blackwood Plantation from 1856 to 1861. In his correspondence with a fellow clergyman in Philadelphia, Thornwell described his growing concern about what he'd termed an unspeakable arrangement at several plantations in his parish. "I have encountered women living in a state that can only be described as captivity," he wrote in 1859. "They are not enslaved in the legal sense being white, yet they are treated as property nonetheless. They are introduced as wives or housekeepers, yet their demeanor suggests something far different. They appear broken in spirit, fearful of speaking freely, and are never permitted to attend services without close supervision." Thornwell described his attempts to intervene in one case, where he offered assistance to a woman named Adelaide, who had managed to speak with him briefly after a service. She whispered that she had been deceived and was being held against her will. "I promised to return with help, but when I did so 3 days later, I was informed that she had been sent away due to illness. The plantation owner, Mr. Ellis, warned me against meddling in private household matters and threatened to have me removed from my position should I persist." The minister's frustration is palpable in a letter dated March 1860. "I have approached the matter with the utmost discretion, speaking only of general Christian duties toward all members of the household. Yet even this gentle admonishment has been met with hostility. Yesterday, after a sermon on kindness, Mr. Blackwood informed me that my services would no longer be required at his plantation, as they would be conducting private devotions henceforth. I fear this means the woman I observed there, who showed signs of recent tears during the service, will now be deprived of even this brief connection to the outside world." The minister's final letter on the subject, dated January 1861, expresses his frustration and moral anguish. "I have brought my concerns to the attention of church authorities, only to be advised that such delicate matters are best left to individual conscience. The war now seems inevitable, and I fear these women's plight will be forgotten amidst the greater calamity that approaches. I am haunted by their faces and by my own failure to effect any change in their circumstances." Thornwell's letters provide rare contemporary documentation of the practice from someone who was neither a perpetrator nor a victim. They also suggest that knowledge of these arrangements extended beyond the immediate participants, creating a community of complicity that helped maintain the silence surrounding the practice. After the outbreak of the Civil War, Thornwell's correspondence ceases. Records indicate that he volunteered as a chaplain in the Confederate Army and died of typhoid fever in 1862, taking with him whatever additional knowledge he may have had about the women he had attempted to help. In 2003, during preparations for a road widening project near what had once been the Blackwood Plantation, construction workers uncovered a small cemetery that did not appear on any maps. Archaeologists identified the remains of 4 women buried without markers or coffins in what appeared to be a hastily prepared site. Analysis of the remains indicated that all 4 were Caucasian women between the ages of 18 and 30 who had died between approximately 1850 and 1865. While it cannot be proven conclusively that these women were victims of the Franklin and Armfield system, the location and circumstances of their burial are consistent with accounts in Blackwood's journals, which mention the deaths of 2 women who proved unsuitable, despite the conditioning process. He notes that they were disposed of quietly on the north edge of the property, and their deaths were not reported to authorities. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed signs of malnutrition and, in 2 cases, healed fractures consistent with physical abuse. One skeleton showed evidence of a pregnancy or recent childbirth at the time of death. The remains were eventually reinterred with a simple marker acknowledging them as unknown women, 1850-1865, but without reference to the circumstances that likely brought them to that isolated grave. The discovery prompted renewed interest in Montgomery's research, leading to a small conference at Howard University in 2004 titled "Forgotten Victims: Expanding Our Understanding of Antebellum Exploitation." The conference proceedings were published in a special issue of the Journal of African American History, marking the first mainstream academic acknowledgement of the Franklin and Armfield case. Dr. Thomas Hendricks, an archaeologist who examined the remains, noted in his contribution to the conference, "The physical evidence tells a story of hardship and mistreatment. The pattern of healed fractures in two of the subjects suggests repeated physical trauma over time, rather than a single accident. Indicators of malnutrition and vitamin deficiency suggest restricted diet, despite the plantation's obvious prosperity. Most telling, perhaps, is the manner of burial, unceremonious, unmarked, and hidden from view. These were not individuals whose passing was mourned or whose lives were valued by those responsible for their interment." The most recent development in this long-suppressed story came in 2017, when renovation work on the Johnson Square building that once housed the auction house revealed hidden chambers that matched the architectural plans discovered by Dr. Williams decades earlier. Ground-penetrating radar identified additional spaces beneath the building that do not appear on any known plans. The current owners, facing public pressure, allowed limited archaeological investigation, but the full exploration was halted when human hair and bone fragments were discovered in one of the sealed rooms. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened an inquiry, but after 6 months, the case was closed without public explanation. The renovation project proceeded, and the building now houses luxury apartments. Residents have reported unusual occurrences, unexpected cold spots, the sound of weeping with no discernible source, and doors that lock and unlock themselves. While such accounts are anecdotal and could be attributed to the power of suggestion, they have contributed to a growing local interest in the building's history. One resident who requested anonymity when interviewed for a local newspaper article in 2019 described finding a small bundle of women's hair tied with a faded ribbon hidden in a space behind a loose baseboard. The resident reported experiencing a sense of overwhelming sadness when handling the item, and later dreamed of a woman in 19th-century dress standing at the foot of the bed, asking for help, finding her way home. Such stories, while impossible to verify scientifically, have become part of the building's folklore. Ghost tours of Savannah now sometimes include Johnson Square on their routes, though they typically focus on more conventional hauntings rather than the specific history of the auction house. Some tour guides report that certain sensitive guests refuse to approach the building, claiming to sense a heavy feeling of despair emanating from it. Beyond these paranormal claims lies a documented history that is in many ways more disturbing. The story of the Franklin and Armfield auction house represents more than just another dark chapter in American history. It illuminates the intersection of race, gender, and economic exploitation in ways that challenge our understanding of the antebellum period. The victimization of these women, forgotten by history and erased from official records, reminds us that the full extent of human suffering during this era may be greater than we have acknowledged. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is not what happened to these women, but how successfully their stories were suppressed for over a century. The systematic destruction of evidence, the silencing of researchers, and the continued reluctance to confront this history suggest that the power structures that enabled such exploitation may not be entirely dismantled. In the archives of Emory University, one document from Dr. Williams' partially destroyed collection remains. It is a letter he wrote, but apparently never sent, addressed to the editor of the Journal of Southern History. In it he writes, "I understand the reluctance to publish material that implicates prominent families, but history is not the servant of reputation. These women, whose names have been struck from every record, whose graves remain unmarked, deserve to have their stories told. Their systematic erasure represents not just a personal tragedy for each victim, but a collective failure of our historical memory." Williams' words resonate with particular force in light of subsequent attempts to suppress research on the topic. When Dr. Montgomery died in 2011, her papers were donated to Howard University's Moorland Spingarn Research Center. According to center staff, within weeks of the donation, They received inquiries from attorneys representing several Southern families requesting access to specific documents for review before public release. The center declined these requests, but shortly thereafter experienced a break-in during which several boxes of Montgomery's research materials were damaged by water from a mysteriously activated sprinkler system. While no direct connection can be proven, the timing raised concerns among Montgomery's colleagues. Dr. James Foster, who worked closely with Montgomery in her final years, described the incident in an interview with the Washington Post. The selective nature of the damage was suspicious. The sprinkler activated directly above the boxes containing Eliza's most sensitive materials, her notes on the connections between prominent families, and the Franklin and Armfield operation. Other materials in the same room were untouched. The official investigation concluded it was a mechanical malfunction, but the coincidence struck many of us as too convenient. Today, as the building on Johnson Square stands renovated and repurposed, few passers-by have any knowledge of what transpired there. A small plaque mentions only that it was once a commercial establishment important to Savannah's antebellum economy. The stories of Catherine and the others remain whispers, echoes that occasionally reach those willing to listen. In 2018, a local historian proposed a memorial to the women victimized by Franklin and Armfield. The proposal was rejected by the city council, with one member stating that speculative history did not warrant such recognition. The sites where these women lived out their lives, remote plantations, now often elegant wedding venues or tourist attractions, make no mention of their presence. Dr. Amelia Richardson, who submitted the memorial proposal, expressed her frustration in an editorial published in the Savannah Morning News. By dismissing this history as speculative, despite the substantial documentary evidence, we perpetuate the very erasure that Franklin and his associates initiated. These women disappeared twice, first physically from their communities and then from our historical memory. A memorial would not only acknowledge their suffering, but affirm our commitment to confronting even the most uncomfortable aspects of our past. The editorial generated considerable controversy, with numerous letters both supporting and opposing Richardson's position. Those in favor emphasized the importance of historical honesty and the moral imperative to acknowledge past injustices. Opponents questioned the validity of the research, the appropriateness of highlighting such a disturbing chapter in the city's history, and the potential impact on tourism. Yet, their story persists, carried forward by researchers who continue to piece together fragments of evidence, by descendants of those who witnessed their suffering, and by those who believe that history must include even its most uncomfortable truths. The ledgers that Dr. Williams discovered, those that survived the archive fire, contain rows of names with annotations, suitable for transition, properly conditioned, resistant, requires special handling. Behind each of these clinical assessments was a woman with hopes, dreams, and a future that was stolen through elaborate deception. One entry from March 1853 reads, Miss Sarah Parkman, 23, formerly of Richmond, father deceased, mother invalid, education excellent, finishing school in Philadelphia. Musical, speaks French, debts total $347, assessed value, whence $200, destination, Coleman Plantation, South Carolina. This cold accounting of a human life raises questions about Sarah's fate. Did she believe, as others did, that she was traveling to a respectable position or an advantageous marriage? How long did it take for her to understand her true situation? Did she resist, acquiesce, or find some way to survive that preserved a portion of her identity? The records are silent on these questions, offering only the bare fact of the transaction. Another entry from November 1854 provides slightly more detail. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, 26, widow of Charleston merchant, considerable debts incurred after husband's death. Well-educated, suitable for household management and social functions. Initial resistance expected due to previous status, but financial situation leaves no alternatives. Assessed value, I lost $500. Destination: Blackwood Plantation, Georgia. A marginal note added in a different hand reads, "Subject delivered as arranged. Blackwood reports initial adjustment proceeding according to expectations. Full compliance anticipated within standard time frame." These entries, with their dispassionate assessment of women's lives in terms of monetary value and anticipated compliance, represent the pinnacle of commodification, the reduction of human beings to assets to be evaluated, purchased, and exploited. And a diary entry attributed to Thomas Armfield, written shortly before his death in 1865, offers perhaps the only expression of remorse from those who orchestrated this system. "I find myself unable to sleep. The faces of those women haunt my dreams. They came to us seeking salvation from poverty and found something far worse. May God forgive what I cannot forget." This belated attack of conscience did nothing to help the women who had passed through the auction house. By the time Armfield wrote these words, many of them had spent years in captivity, their identities systematically erased, their connections to family and community severed, their very existence as free women denied. No formal legal proceedings ever addressed these crimes. By the time the full extent of the operation was understood, all directly responsible parties were long deceased. The families who benefited indirectly from these activities, descendants of the buyers, have largely denied any knowledge of their ancestors' actions or dismissed the accounts as fabrications. In the summer of 1963, shortly before Dr. Williams was pressured to abandon his research, he conducted what would be his final interview related to the case. The subject was Martha Blackwood Patterson, then 91 years old, and the granddaughter of Jeremiah Blackwood. According to Williams' notes, Patterson initially denied any knowledge of unusual circumstances at her grandfather's plantation. But as the interview progressed, she made a statement that Williams found significant. Grandfather had particular ideas about household management. The women who came to oversee the domestic affairs rarely stayed more than a year or two. As a child, I was told they had gone to visit family and simply never returned. It was only later that I wondered why none of them ever wrote to us or why their supposed relatives never inquired after them. Patterson elaborated, "There was one woman, I believe her name was Eleanor, who taught me to play the piano. She was very accomplished, and I was fond of her. One morning I went for my lesson and was told she had departed suddenly during the night. I was quite upset, as she had promised to teach me a particular piece, and I couldn't understand why she would leave without saying goodbye. When I cried, Grandfather told me that such women were unreliable by nature and that I should not become attached to servants." This recollection, with its childlike perspective on what was likely a much darker situation, provides a rare glimpse into how the system perpetuated itself through carefully constructed narratives. The casual explanation of women's sudden disappearances as normal and expected helped normalize what should have been recognized as suspicious patterns. When Williams pressed further, Patterson reportedly terminated the interview saying, "Some family matters are better left undisturbed. The South has carried enough burdens without adding to them." Patterson's reluctance to acknowledge what may have been happening in her childhood home is perhaps understandable. To confront such knowledge would require a fundamental reassessment of family history and personal identity. Yet her brief moment of reflection, her adult recognition that the explanations provided in her childhood did not make sense, suggests that on some level she understood that something was not right. This pattern of knowing and not knowing, of recognition and denial, appears repeatedly in accounts related to the Franklin and Armfield operation. It suggests a kind of collective cognitive dissonance, a community-wide suppression of uncomfortable truths that allowed the practice to continue despite its visibility. The last known victim of the Franklin and Armfield system was a woman identified in Blackwood's journal only as Miss Emerson from Virginia. She arrived at his plantation in early 1864, just months before Sherman's march through Georgia would forever alter the landscape of the South. The final entry regarding her, dated November 12, 1864, reads, "Miss E. attempted escape last night, taking advantage of the chaos caused by news of Sherman's approach. She was recovered this morning at the Miller property, having sought refuge with their house servant. I have decided that she is unsuitable and have arranged for her transfer to the Coleman plantation in Alabama beyond the likely path of Union forces. No further record of Miss E. has ever been found. Her fate, like that of so many others, remains lost in the deliberate gaps of the historical record. Yet her attempt to escape, despite the risks and despite what must have been a realistic assessment of her chances, speaks to an enduring human resistance to oppression that persists even in the most hopeless circumstances. As Union forces moved through Georgia, many plantations were abandoned by their owners, who fled with whatever valuables they could transport. Enslaved people seized the opportunity for freedom, with many joining the advancing Union Army. But the status of women like Miss E. remained ambiguous. Without documentation of their free status, without family connections or resources, they existed in a perilous limbo. Some accounts suggest that a few of these women were able to establish new identities in the post-war chaos. A letter found in the archives of a Freedmen's Bureau office in Atlanta, dated 1866, describes a white woman living among the colored refugees who claims she was held against her will on the Blackwood plantation, though she possesses no papers to verify her status. She refuses to give her name, saying only that she was dead once before and will not risk dying again. The Bureau officer who recorded this encounter noted that the woman appeared highly educated but severely traumatized, and that she flinches at any sudden movement and refuses to be alone with any man. The officer arranged for her transportation to a women's relief society in Ohio, but there the trail ends. Whether she was able to rebuild her life remains unknown. Other women may not have survived to see liberation. Blackwood's journals make reference to several who succumbed to melancholy or perished from fever, euphemisms that may mask more sinister causes of death. The unmarked graves discovered in 2003 suggest that some women may have died in captivity, their passing unrecorded and unmourned, except by those in similar circumstances. The physical and psychological toll of such captivity can only be imagined. Modern understanding of trauma suggests that the methods described in Franklin's guidelines, isolation, identity erasure, gaslighting, would produce severe and lasting psychological damage. For women who had previously lived as free citizens, the sudden and incomprehensible loss of autonomy, coupled with the realization that the society they had trusted had abandoned them, must have been devastating. The story of the Franklin and Armfield auction house and its victims exists now primarily as fragments, diary entries, architectural anomalies, unmarked graves, and the persistent efforts of researchers to piece together a coherent narrative from deliberately obscured evidence. The official history of Savannah, with its emphasis on elegant homes and refined society, has little room for such uncomfortable truths. Yet the physical spaces remain. The building on Johnson Square still stands, though few who enter it know its history. The plantation houses, many now wedding venues or bed and breakfasts, offer sanitized versions of the past that make no mention of the women who lived and died within their walls. In 2020, a graduate student at the University of Georgia discovered additional materials related to the case while researching an unrelated topic. In the personal papers of a Savannah attorney named Hiram Pierce, who died in 1875, she found correspondence with James Franklin that discussed the legal mechanisms used to facilitate the transitions of these women. In one letter, Pierce advises, "The employment contract should be worded such that the woman believes she is accepting a position as governess or companion with a substantial advance against future earnings. This creates the debt that will later be used to justify her continued service." The second document, which she will not see, transfers all legal authority over her person to the purchaser. Both must be notarized, though I have arranged for a clerk who understands the necessity for discretion. This evidence suggests that the operation was even more sophisticated than previously understood, involving not just the auction house proprietors, but also members of the legal profession who helped create the appearance of legitimacy. The students' discovery prompted renewed interest in the case, leading to a small exhibit at the University of Georgia Library. However, the exhibit was vandalized twice during its 3-week run, with specific documents destroyed. Campus police investigated, but identified no suspects. The remaining materials were returned to the archives and restricted to scholarly access only. This pattern of discovery and suppression, revelation and denial has characterized the history of the Franklin and Armfield case from the beginning. It raises questions about whose history is preserved and whose is erased, about the mechanisms by which uncomfortable truths are marginalized or excluded from the mainstream historical narrative. The women who passed through the auction house left few direct traces in the historical record. Their letters, when they survive, represent rare moments when they were able to assert their identities against the systematic effort to erase them. Catherine's unsent letter to her mother, with its poignant expression of dawning horror, stands as perhaps the most direct testimony we have from any victim.